Well, I think we'll just crack on. And hello, everybody. Welcome to this event about how we can move towards a nature-positive economy for Scotland. We are really pleased you could join us. I'm McCall. I'm the Director of RSPB Scotland, and really looking forward to the discussion today. So this event is part of a series set up by RSPB Scotland and Scottish Environment Link. We wanted to take the opportunity to brief MSPs and researchers about some key steps for tackling the nature emergency here in Scotland ahead of the big international nature conference COP15 that's taking place later this year. As ever, there's just a few practicalities to run through before we get going. I am sure that all of us are more than familiar with webinar etiquette by now, but as usual, if you could keep yourselves muted during the presentations and the discussion. Once we get to the Q&A session, you can just pop comments and questions in the chat bar, or simply put your hand up if you'd like to speak. I know there's quite a lot of expertise in the audiences as well as from the speakers. I should advise you that this session is being recorded. Our intention was also to live stream it on Scottish Environment Link's YouTube channel. I think we're enjoying some technical challenges with that. So if we don't manage to link up to the live stream, we will be putting the recording up later on for folk to have a look at. So with those formalities out of the way, I just wanted to say a little bit about our topic for today. And first of all, just a quick refresher about what COP15 is. COP15 is the next big meeting of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, which is expected to take place in Kunming in China towards the end of the summer. So this is a hugely important moment for nature globally. It's where world leaders and experts from around the world will gather to agree a new deal for nature up to 2030. So it's basically like COP26, which obviously focused on climate, but for nature, and hopefully with a bit more success than COP26. I hope we all know how urgently we need to act on this issue. It has been heartening to see a growing understanding and awareness over the last few years that we're not just facing a climate emergency, but a nature and climate emergency, a twin crisis that has to be tackled as one. This is as true in Scotland as anywhere else. I mean, while Scotland is, quite rightly sort of famous for its wildlife and its landscapes, it was recently found to be one of the most nature depleted countries in the world, coming 212th out of 240 countries and territories in an assessment that looked at how intact our nature remains. A lot of that loss is historical, but evidence shows that we are still losing nature now. I think despite this growing awareness that nature is being lost around the world faster than ever, we are not seeing this translate into actions quickly enough. And in response, an international movement has emerged calling for leaders to commit to nature positive by 2050. So this is an equivalent goal to net zero, but it's for nature. And nature positive has the objective of halting and reversing the decline in biodiversity and helping nature to recover. In Scotland, a nature positive approach, I hope, would ensure we have more nature at the end of the decade than we started with, meaning that by 2030, we have halted declines and are driving the recovery, putting us on an upward path to restoring the health of nature by 2045. So in the first session of this series of kind of short bespoke seminars we're doing, we held that in Parliament a few weeks ago, and we discussed some of the crucial actions we need to see happening here in Scotland to successfully implement this new global framework for nature. And that includes the publication of a robust and hopefully ambitious Scottish biodiversity strategy, which we're expecting to see this autumn. We also need to see reform of agricultural subsidies to deliver public goods and put nature at the heart of government in all portfolios. Another action, and the focus of today, that's going to be absolutely crucial is transforming our economy. Our economies depend on nature, but we know that instead they're actually driving the degradation of it. And that's got pretty dire consequences. If we allow that to continue, we are undermining our own future too, placing future economies and future well-being at risk. Shifting to a nature positive economy that operates within the planet's natural limits is urgently needed, but also creates opportunities. And here in Scotland, I think we've got some particular opportunities that I hope we can highlight throughout the session today. I'm very pleased that Scottish Government committed to deliver a nature positive economy in the recent National Strategy for Economic Transformation, which I know we're going to hear more about from our speakers. But I would say that as of yet, there's no real clarity about what that will mean in practice. I think Scotland's got a huge opportunity to show real leadership on this issue, but in order to deliver, there is some urgency needed in clarifying what a nature positive economy actually is, what it could look like in Scotland, how we can get there, and how we can measure success. So, to unpack this topic a bit more, we've got three great panelists lined up for you, who will open up the session by giving some short presentations on specific areas. First of all, we'll hear from Dougie Peedle, who's Head of Policy at Scottish Wildlife Trust and an economist by background. He's going to talk a bit more about what a nature positive economy is and some key policy steps for Scotland. He'll be followed by James Curran of the Green Purposes Company, who also has a long history working in the environment sector, and will talk about some of the investment needs and opportunities for funding nature's recovery in Scotland. And finally, we'll hear from Jane Morrison, who is a biologist and board member of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Scotland, who will talk about nature's role in a wellbeing economy. We'll then have a bit of a Q&A session and have some time to hear your views and questions. So it gives me great pleasure to hand over to our first panelist, Dougie, over to you. And I think you've got some slides that hopefully will seamlessly be shared.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Anne, and good afternoon, everyone. If you just bear with me for a second or two while I hopefully share things. If Anne, you can just let me know when it's showing.
We've got the presenter view at the moment.
Okay. Is that any better?
No, still the same.
Sometimes it just takes a minute to catch up. No,
it's come up if you maybe pop into the display settings and shift it to the, because I think it's in presenter view.
Okay.
Perfect. The swap presenter view, top one. I think that'll do the business.
Is that it?
Perfect. Great.
Brilliant. Okay, as I say, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry about that slight delay. What I want to cover just briefly is a quick overview of where we are in Scotland, some of the things that Anna's already touched on. Also, quite importantly, how the expert advice that's out there can maybe help us develop our approach, and in particular, focusing on the actions that we really need to see in Scotland if we are to deliver on a nature positive economy. So first off, in terms of where we're at, there has been some encouraging developments this year with the publication of the National Strategy for Economic Transformation, which clearly set out a commitment to build that nature positive economy, recognising that involved reversing biodiversity loss by 2030, also drawing on the kind of international experience as well, and recognition now that transforming to a nature positive economy could have significant job implications, could have significant benefits in terms of overall economic activity, and also with organisations like the World Economic Forum saying that actually the nature crisis is now one of the top 3 risks that the global economy faces over the next 10 years. So we've got some positive aspects there. I think there is a little bit of a but that comes alongside that, in fact, that within the NSET, the Economic Transformation Strategy, there are a number of work streams, 5 or 6 in total, all focusing on delivery, taking forward key priorities within NSET. Unfortunately, one of those isn't around a nature positive economy. So we really need to see that this has got a home and within the strategy, and actually a delivery plan that takes it forward. In terms of actually thinking, okay, how can we build on that kind of high level commitment within the strategy? As I say, we can draw on some of the expert advice that's out there. And I think one of the most important things we can draw from is the Dasgupta review of the economics of biodiversity. This is very much done by an esteemed professor from Cambridge University, and it was advice for finance ministries across the globe, really looking at how they can properly take on board the economics of biodiversity. His overarching finding was quite a simple one. It's simple truth that our economies are embedded within nature. It's fairly easy to say, and there's a lovely diagram there recognizing it. Quite often it's seen that biodiversity, nature, climate are separate from social issues and economic issues. But his thinking is very much something that we probably all recognize in ourselves, that the economy is embedded in nature, and that actually a healthy natural environment, improvements in biodiversity go hand in hand with economic success. But what does that mean in kind of more kind of action? Dasgupta sets out a number of areas where we can work on. Overall, it's quite clear that we need to change how we think, act, and measure success, quite simply. And there's three areas that he said we should focus on, and Anne touched on some of these already. First off, just the whole concept that we need to look at our demands on nature and make sure they do not exceed the supply that nature can deliver. We depend on a whole host of benefits from nature. If we're drawing too much on those above that ability to supply, then we face some of the consequences that we're familiar with today. And quite importantly, within that, we need to look at nature restoration and making sure that nature is able to be restored and deliver the benefits that we demand from it. Also within that, we need to look at how we define our economic success. This isn't a case of completely throwing away and disregarding things like GDP and other economic metrics that we look at the moment, but actually developing a much more holistic approach and something that can really target what is going to be well-being. And I'm sure we'll touch on that in some of the other presentations later on. And then finally, just recognizing the transformation that's needed. This isn't about business as usual. We need transformation across the board, and particularly within finance and education system. So what does that mean in a Scottish context? First off, just thinking about demands on nature and making sure they do not exceed the ability of nature to supply them. First off, it's probably quite clearly we need legally binding nature targets. They need to be challenging and they need to be setting out that ambition to not just reverse the loss by 2030, but start to actually improve biodiversity on an ongoing basis beyond that period of time. Anne's touched on some of the information that we have around the performance of biodiversity in Scotland. We know that over the longer term, we've seen sustained declines in the abundance and occupancy of biodiversity in Scotland, as shown within these charts. We know it's a global problem, but those numbers that Anne mentioned in terms of where we actually rank relative to other countries show that we've really got a job to do in Scotland. And without those legally binding targets, we can't really see the action, the priority given to nature that it deserves. We've seen the success that climate targets can have and help in terms of focusing attention and, quite importantly, also focusing resources. And that's something that's got to be really important. There is a commitment to do that from Scottish Government at this point in time, but we need to make sure we get those targets right and also that they're delivered quickly. We are in a decade of ecosystem restoration and we can't afford to just sit on our laurels and wait for these things to happen. In terms of other areas, the second one is investing in nature-based solutions, and quite particularly going further than what Scotland's committed to at the moment. Dasgupta was clear around nature-based solutions and the fundamental role they can play, and actually the range of benefits that we can get across a whole host of areas, whether it's from a well-being perspective, whether it's been from a climate perspective, and whether there's social benefits as well. Investment in nature can deliver across the board. But in Scotland, we've got encouraging commitments around peatland. We have some commitments around forestry, which are probably a little bit generic at the moment and too focused on non-native species, but we can go further in Scotland and really need to go further if we want to see the level of transformation that's required. What does that mean? Well, it means looking at nature-based solutions in our urban environment, delivering more for nature, delivering more for ourselves as well in the urban environment, and quite importantly as well, the marine environment. It's a classic area where our own pressures are impacting on the marine environment. We can look at reducing those pressures, really getting that balance between the demand we place on the marine environment and the ability for it to supply those benefits. Thirdly, we can also look, as Anne has already touched on, in the area of kind of financial support. Dasgupta was clear that across the globe, finance that harms nature outweighs finance that supports and benefits nature by something like the scope of 5 to 1. In Scotland, we've got an opportunity, and Scottish Government is already looking at this in terms of reforming agricultural payments in Scotland. We've got £700 million there, which is already being used. If we can target that, make sure that we get more for nature and the environment from that money, it's not new money, it's just repurposing it, and also making sure that we deliver long-term requirements on food and sustainability, and hopefully meeting nature targets as well. Also in this area, we can also look at really the resilience of nature. If we're going to deliver the improvements that we expect by 2030 and beyond, and hopefully meet those challenging legally binding targets, we need to look at things like local networks and the connectivity of nature across Scotland. Very much at the moment, we're on the left-hand side of this chart in terms of having a very fragmented landscape. If through things like local nature networks, we can connect up the landscape, that's going to help improve the resilience and abundance of biodiversity in Scotland. It's really encouraging that we've got a commitment again to do local nature networks in Scotland, but there's a number of areas where we can hopefully build on that approach. One, making sure that those local nature networks at an aggregate level deliver for Scotland strategically, that they're connected, that there's a strategic approach and coordination across those local nature networks, and really quite importantly, that there's also funding to help deliver those local nature networks. At the moment, the commitment appears to be that local authorities will be required to deliver these networks, and of course at the moment finances in local authorities are very tight. We need to make sure that it's not just a commitment there, and that actually there's meaningful resources behind that commitment too. Talking about changing measures of success, I'm sure we're going to hear much more about this from James, so I won't dwell too much on this, but from our perspective, it's very much about looking at well-being as a whole. And from my perspective, biodiversity is a fundamental pillar of well-being, and I think that's recognised elsewhere. Scotland can learn from countries elsewhere. One of its partners in the Wellbeing Government Alliance is New Zealand, which has a living standards framework which goes across all aspects of well-being, and really importantly, and this is quite a fundamental point, this has actually fed through into policy change. So they've had a well-being budget in New Zealand, taking this framework, which, as I say, includes all aspects of well-being, and quite importantly, when you drill down, biodiversity is included in that. So there's a real opportunity to develop the framework within Scotland and also make sure that it delivers on actual and changes decision making. Finally, on the third area, transform finance and education. There's lots we can do around the educational sphere. We've seen Department for Education south of the border committing to do a GCSE in natural history. What are we going to do in Scotland in terms of educational reform? On this slide, I focused a little bit more on the finance side. There's a whole number of areas where we can look at transforming finance in Scotland. Some of it is public money, but it's not all about public money. It is about private funding as well, and looking at new sources of finance for nature restoration. But first off, there's some simple things. Over a sustained period, we've seen environmental funding in Scotland deteriorate, not just in real terms, but also as a proportion of overall funding. If we're going to give nature and the environment the right priority, then we've got to see a change in those dynamics going forward. We could start with the resource spending review. The consultation was published earlier this year, but within it, there's three priorities. One of them is climate, but there's very little mention of biodiversity in the whole document. It's in danger of falling into the trap of thinking that the nature crisis is just a subset of the climate crisis, which of course we all know is not the case. They are linked, but they're not the same thing. So actually getting a resource spending review that recognises the need to reverse the trends in biodiversity can be fundamental in making sure that we get flow through from all the various strands and actually finance delivering for nature as well. Also within the infrastructure investment plan, if you're looking at investment in the natural environment, it's very encouraging that within that infrastructure investment plan, the natural infrastructure is now considered part of the overall infrastructure, which makes sense, obviously. The slight problem is that actually there's no funding within the infrastructure investment plan for natural infrastructure, and that needs to change as well. UK Committee on Climate Change said that we need to think about taxation. That applies, I think, in Scotland. If we're looking at how we manage and change production and consumption in the economy, there's potentially a role for taxation, and we shouldn't rule that out. And finally, I mentioned the important role for private investment. The Scottish Wildlife Trust, in conjunction with SEPA, did the £1 billion challenge, which looked at new innovative solutions to conservation finance. And there's a whole area there which can be developed, not least in areas like helping conservation projects be ready for investment and actually helping the way they actually make the case for investment in nature. So just to conclude, nice quote there from Das Gupta himself in terms of the fact that we know what to do, but the time to do it is actually now. And we are running out of time, and the time is really for delivery and actually more money going into nature restoration. I think I'll stop there and hand over to the next speaker, and I'm happy to take questions when we get to that point.
Okay, yeah, I'm James Curran. Thanks for that, Dougie, and hello everyone. Really good to be with you here this afternoon. You'll see on the notes for this meeting that my attribution on the panel is the Green Purposes Company. And some of you may not know what that is, so just very briefly, this was set up by the UK Parliament when the state-owned Green Investment Bank was sold off into the private sector. And the Green Purposes Company holds a single special share, which gives voting control over the 5 green purposes that the original state-owned bank has, and that remain in the Articles of Association for the Green Investment Bank now that it's privatised and owned by Macquarie Bank. Green Investment Bank now really calls itself the Green Investment Group and invests globally and is a huge investor in green solutions. I'm mentioning that specifically because one of the 5 green purposes is the protection or enhancement of biodiversity. And for that reason, we on the Green Purposes Company, there's only 5 individuals, that's all we are, the trustees. We've recently commissioned a small report, which has just been released, undertaking a global review of investment in nature recovery. And the consultants we took on actually called it an emerging institutional asset class. They rated it that highly in terms of its potential for attracting considerable sums. The Green Finance Institute has estimated that £20 billion is needed over the next 10 years to restore Scotland's nature. Scottish Government has committed £500 million over 5 years in the natural economy, which is obviously closely related. But yeah, we need 20 times more, don't we? And that is very likely only to come from private funding. And the report that we in the Green Purposes Company commissioned shows that that should be possible. For example, the report shows that in reviewing investments globally worth $1.5 billion, each of those investments was giving a return on investment to the investor a financial return of between 2% and 12%, which is pretty competitive. And most of these were blended investments with public grants up front, providing an element of de-risking so that private finance was being attracted into the project as well. And the income for these projects globally was derived from two potential sources, one being commodity or service sales, which might be things like obviously timber or agricultural produce, and the other was monetization of cost benefit, which means reducing the potential future costs of things like carbon release, so sequestering carbon. Obviously carbon credits is a big money earner these days, reducing flooding impact or the likelihood of flooding, and perhaps improving water quality for water supply measures. So that's what's called stacked income, seeking out income from a number of different sources. It's quite complex. So, you know, it's my belief, and it was the belief of the report as well, that the environmental NGOs have a potentially crucial role to play here, and could become developers of projects that would provide these kind of services and therefore attract private sector funding on the back of de-risking from the public sector. Some of the actions obviously in our report, and there were very few of them made, but there were actions recommended, and that is allocating budgets obviously from government and other public sources appropriately into things like regenerative agriculture, and that there must be proper reporting. And an interesting one is about creating centres of excellence or centres of expertise, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. So why is all this needed? Well, Dougie's already mentioned some of this. The World Trade Organization reckons that 55% of global GDP is dependent on fully functioning ecosystems. And at the moment, and again reflecting some of Dougie's figures, 25% of species worldwide are at risk of extinction. In fact, the rate of extinction currently is 1,000 times higher than in the early human period. And distressingly, 70% of people in the UK believe that there will be less variety of life within the next 50 years. So we're on a pathway to self-destruction if we're not very careful. And COP15, which has already been mentioned, is very likely to demand this kind of action anyway. Released before the next meeting of COP15 is the so-called Global Biodiversity Framework, and it has a number of elements in it, obviously, and this is going to be discussed at COP15. And I just wanted to pick out three to mention. One is that there will be, hopefully, from my point of view anyway, a requirement to fully integrate biodiversity into all policies, into all regulation, into all accounts, most interestingly, across all of society. And that all businesses will need to report biodiversity use and impact and reduce that impact by 50%. And again, something that Dougie mentioned, adverse incentives and subsidies need to be entirely removed. And a third reason for why all of this is needed, again, as Dougie mentioned, is that the World Economic Forum, in releasing its global risk reports for 2022, always enumerate the main risks to the planet and to all of us who live on this planet. And of the top 8, 5 are directly environmental, and arguably one of the others, that makes 6, is very closely related. What are they? Number 1, climate action failure, and climate and biodiversity are so intrinsically linked. Number 2, extreme weather, again, pretty close link. Number 3, biodiversity loss. Number 4, social cohesion. Jane may say something about that. 5 is a livelihood crisis. 6, infectious diseases. Well, you might be surprised that's right down at number 6 in the middle of a global pandemic. 7, human environmental damage, and 8, a natural resources crisis. Yeah, those risks are really stacking up, and it's well beyond time that we take some pretty radical action to tackle them. So this is urgent and extreme. And as I said, nature and climate, which figures largely in that list there as well, are intrinsically linked. Well, what's the response here? Again, Dougie has already mentioned this, the National Strategy for Economic Transformation, and I don't really need to tell the audience much about that, you'll know it intimately, but it has three ambitions: a fairer, wealthier and greener Scotland. And the greener bit that we're interested here now today is embedded within the 5 programmes, but it's interestingly under the heading of new markets. And under that kind of description, within developing new markets, of which, you know, investing for nature recovery is one, there's an intention to improve access to private capital for things like sustainable agriculture, nature restoration and nature-based solutions. And within that context, it does mention the Scottish National Investment Bank, but if you look at their current investments, there are 14, and only one, as far as I can judge, is even in any way connected to the potential for nature restoration. So there's quite a bit to do there to improve performance, I would say. An interesting aspect as well under this new markets heading is cluster building. And yes, that would very much reflect an action within the Green Purposes Company report that I mentioned earlier. Investors, combined with the massive expertise of environmental NGOs, and particularly here in Scotland, I would say, can create jointly, with a close strategic collaboration, high reputation, well-evidenced investment propositions that will attract money and make nature restoration a possibility within Scotland. One area I will criticise, there could be many others, but I will certainly criticise the National Strategy for Economic Transformation, is that it's extremely weak on circular economy. And I could say a lot more about that. Maybe there'll be an opportunity during questions, but I sincerely hope that the circular economy bill coming forward fairly soon in the Scottish Parliament will be really radical. And why do I say that? One very simple answer. It's been estimated and widely quoted that 90% of biodiversity loss globally is due to extraction of raw materials and subsequent processing. So maybe we'll come back to that a little bit later. But I'll pass on now to Jane, the next speaker.
Thanks, James. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me along today. So forgive me for starting off by being a bit bleak, and we've covered some of this already, but I think it is important to remind ourselves of what we're up against when we're looking at, I suppose, the different crises that we're facing as a society, and why the economic system that we've inherited is not fit for purpose. So we've talked a bit about biodiversity loss, climate change, but we're also facing a cost of living crisis, vast wealth inequality, increasing future pandemic risks, loneliness and mental health issues being on the rise. And it's quite easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale and the complexity of what we're up against. People in Scotland are starting to feel the effects of our environmental destruction, which has been harming communities in the global south for decades. We know we simply can't go on as we have been. Limiting the worst impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss, as well as the social crises, will require a radical transformation of our economy. So there's lots of names for what this transformation might look like, whether it's donut economics, nature positive economy, wellbeing economy. But what these models have in common is that they ask us to look beyond the limited and often too narrow economic success measures that we currently use, like GDP, and find a more holistic way of doing things by measuring what truly matters in creating better lives for us, and at the same time protecting and regenerating nature. GDP is basically an algorithm for how quickly we can turn natural resources and people's efforts into money. To give an example, GDP would count things like deforestation as a success, but it doesn't put value on our living forests, which of course provide a home for nature, space for recreation, and manufacture something that we all need to live, oxygen. It doesn't account for the links between the loss of nature and emerging diseases, like James mentioned as well. GDP would measure the production from a factory, but it doesn't consider how the pollution might worsen health outcomes for the local community in that area. Crucially, GDP also doesn't take into account or even value caring and unpaid work, without which most of our society couldn't function. And of course, a lot of this is done disproportionately by women. So when we're chasing growth in GDP as our only goal, we're less able to incentivize the decisions that protect both nature and ourselves. At the moment, our economy deals with these challenges by following a few steps. First of all, we try and get the economy to grow bigger, but we don't worry too much about the damage that that's doing to people or environment. Then we set aside money through taxes and channel some of this money back into helping people and the planet cope with step number one. But what this model ignores is the reality of diminishing marginal returns. And sorry if you're already familiar with this concept, but essentially it's the idea that you get less value back the more you have of something. And we like to think of this as being a little bit like salt. You need a bit of it in your diet and it brings out the flavour of food. But the more you add, the less it's going to enhance the flavour and your health, which is a bit like economic growth. Countries and communities need enough of it to meet their basic needs, and it can yield returns when it's well directed, but you get to a point where those benefits of growth start to tail off. A well-being economy is different because it would deliver a fair distribution of wealth, health, and well-being while protecting the planet's resources for future generations and species. We wouldn't be content to ask policy, government, and charities to fix, heal, and clean up, but instead our economy would be designed in a way that gets things right the first time around, and it would do more of the heavy lifting by regenerating the planet and delivering for communities rather than extracting from them. A well-being economy is one that is designed with health and well-being of people and planet as its goal. And it's a principle that's hard to argue with, but it does mark a substantial shift in the way that we've traditionally thought about economics. By using our economy to deliver good lives for people the first time around, we can avoid having to deliver expensive downstream interventions to fix the social and environmental damage caused by our growth-focused economies. We would prioritise actions that have wider benefits for people and planet. Government, businesses and communities would be working together to deliver on this goal, and we would only pursue growth in areas that contribute to our collective well-being and shrink areas of the economy that damage it. At the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, we've worked with our many members from around the world to come up with design principles for a wellbeing economy. These are 5 seemingly simple principles, but they have a lot sitting behind them. They're concepts that can be found in Indigenous wisdom, religious texts, research, and in many surveys asking people about what really matters to them in life. The new economic system we all need would be designed for, firstly, fairness, with justice at its heart. Secondly, nature, a safe and restored natural world for all life. Thirdly, participation, citizen engagement, and locally rooted economies. Fourthly, connection, and institutions that serve the common good. And lastly, but crucially, dignity. Everyone has enough to live in comfort, safety, and happiness. So there's not much to disagree with in there, and these are all things that we need and care about. But the fact is that in general, our current systems and institutions are not set up with these principles in their design. Instead, they're designed to pursue economic growth. If instead we applied these kinds of principles to how we live and work and make decisions, we could begin to repair, regenerate, and heal our relationship with nature and create more resilient and connected communities who can thrive. A wellbeing economy asks us to come together around what really matters to us. Things like joy, the food we eat, our community, music, nature, health, and meaningful work. It asks us to count these things in our decision making. When we see headlines and reports full of apocalyptic scenes, I think it's hard not to worry that this is going to be the future for us, and this is the story that we're going to live. Sometimes it's easier to imagine this and slide into apathy than it can be to actually imagine how we might reshape and do things differently. The stories we're telling are what happens if we fail, but a well-being economy or a nature-positive economy offers us something different, a positive vision for our future, one that can bring us together, inspire us to act, to save what we love, and a story that we can move towards with courage and hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, and a huge thank you to all of our presenters this lunchtime. So now is a chance for you to ask any of the speakers some questions or some reflections or comments. I was having a look at the chat. I'm not sure we've had very many in just yet. I think Isabel's going to be monitoring to see if, assuming we've got the YouTube stream up and running, and see if we've got any comments coming in there. But I think we've got a hand up there from Matthew at Friends of the Earth. Matthew, do you want to unmute yourself and ask? Great, thanks.
I don't seem to be able to turn my video on. That's odd. Yeah, people who know me won't be surprised that I'm not backward in coming forward, so I'll just seize the chance to speak. And also, maybe just quite used to me being calling a spade. And so I've got a very specific question, and I'll say what it is first, and then I'll just explain why it's important. But it's a pretty definitely important question, whatever perspective you have, is do we know, I'm putting this to Dougie, putting this to James and others, do we know how we think we can measure those aspects around nature and biodiversity in such ways that they can be integrated into economic and public funding decision making? Because I personally don't know if I know, if you see what I mean. And so and obviously if we don't know, or if there isn't an accepted way of doing it, then it's obviously got to be a priority to settle down on, when you say measure the impact on nature, or when you say, whether you say measure how you are, a company or a public funding program is going to improve nature, what do we expect people to be using in terms of their data and so on? And I just want to say that that's going to be very, very relative to both what we ask of, say, the infrastructure investment program, but also in relation to expectations that private finance will be investing in the good stuff. And I'll just take this very briefly into the National Strategy on Economic Transformation, which I think is extremely disappointing, because it's not really been drawn out that almost all the actions say nothing about nature or climate even. So what we have to do in that is require that all the actions, that not the ones which do mention nature, but all the ones which don't mention nature, we've still got to require that they respect that. So again, we need to go in armed with that sort of capacity to say, oh, you don't know how to do it, these are the ways and the techniques for doing that. So that I hope that's a helpful question.
Thanks, Matthew. And I think certainly conversations around decision grade data for investors is one which is I've certainly been engaged with quite frequently of late. What I was going to do is maybe take Jamie's question as well, and then give our speakers a chance to reflect and come back on the sort of component parts of either. Jamie, you got a question or an observation?
Thanks, Anne. I'm Jamie at RSPB, working with colleagues on the economy. A great overview. My question is, could you give us a specific project or example that would bring your nature positive economy to life? So something really tangible you'd see or see out there in the landscape in the years ahead that you think is a best example. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks, Jamie. So if I could go to our speakers for any thoughts or reflections on, firstly, Matthew's questions around how we measure success, I think I would summarise that as, and Jamie's looking for a sort of tangible example. James, are you wanting to come in?
Yeah, I'll have a go. Matthew's question is an interesting one. I suppose I take a slightly different, you might say more pragmatic view. It is really important to put metrics around this kind of stuff. And COP26 in Glasgow has certainly begun to nail down carbon reporting, for example, which will need to be done on an internationally agreed kind of format. So there will be nowhere to hide in future in terms of carbon reporting under COP26. And I'm sure the same will be moved towards in COP15 and the biodiversity equivalent. But again, these things can be so complex and it can take so long to derive internationally agreed standards. And there is work going on standards of green reporting for investors and investment organizations. But that should not hold us up. We should put in place metrics that we can actually use, and they can always be improved or changed in the future. The work that I contribute towards on the Green Purposes Company reviews metrics that the green investment group uses globally against its 5 green purposes. Now, they would agree they're not perfect. We would agree they're not perfect. But we know what they're doing, and we can go in and do a kind of scrutiny and assessment on it under an understanding that we have with them. It's not part of our kind of statutory process at all. So, you know, I sometimes think we worry too much about standards. We need to get on and start delivering rather than worrying about standards. They can be improved as we go along. And standards are always related to transparency, and transparency simply is not enough in itself. It never will be enough. There needs to be a degree of obligation attached to investing for nature restoration. So as regards the other question on actual examples, the actual example I'm going to give is one I could go on about for the rest of the afternoon, but I'll try not to. And that is, and I have no affiliation to this company, but the wonderful company Interface, which makes carpet tiles. Now that seems a strange kind of topic to introduce at this stage, but it's a global company, $1 billion, and it makes carpet tiles. Carpet tile itself is straight away the most fantastic sustainable design, but their carpet tiles are recycled, carbon neutral, and indeed they offer to companies, not to individuals, a leasing service. You lease your floor covering, you don't actually buy it. So they maintain it and replace carpet tiles as need be. What a fantastic circular economy solution. And that company was founded by an absolute pioneer who, quote, dared to believe that this kind of approach to business was possible. His successors, because he's sadly dead now, dare to believe that they can actually become what's called a regenerative business, putting more back into nature than they even take out in their manufacturing processes. And they're building what they call forest factories. The factories contribute back to nature. That's my example.
Brilliant. Thanks, James. Do any of our other speakers want to come in on either of those questions? Dougie, you want to come in?
Yeah, I'll come in on both. In terms of measurement, I think that the short answer to Matthew's question is yes, we do. We've got a whole host of information and data sources that we can use to assess biodiversity now. In Scotland, it's by no means perfect, but this is one of the cases, you know, where perfection can really be an enemy if you're not careful. And what we can do is really improve on the way we use that data. The whole point about putting targets in place, we've got enough information to do that, to make them legally binding and actually get money to follow those targets and investment to actually change things. I think is, you know, absolutely necessary. You know, the other thing is just to be wary about expecting perfect measurement of impact across the board. Even, you know, decisions that are taken within the economy, data is always a limiting factor in whatever we do, and assessing the impact of decision making is always hard to do. So I think, one, we want to see a little bit of parity, recognition. Also, just in terms of, you know, the overall approach. Dieter Helm, I think, stole a quote from John Maynard Keynes about, at the moment, we're getting things, you know, precisely wrong. We need to move in the direction of getting things broadly right. So we shouldn't see, you know, a lack of data in a certain area as a reason to procrastinate and not actually, you know, implement the transformations that are needed. We know the direction we can move, and there's so much we can do to move in that direction and start the transformation on the basis of what we know now. And also, we really need to be evidence-based in terms of the decisions we make and draw on all evidence, science in particular, not just kind of traditional economic evidence. So I think that's really important question on measurement. Also, in terms of the frameworks that we actually use to make decisions and the frameworks within government, I think there is a little bit concern that things like the Green Book that's used to assess different decisions and the impact of different decisions maybe focuses too much on financial returns and hasn't yet got to the point where it looks at wider well-being, social returns, environmental and biodiversity returns as well. So there is areas certainly where we can improve, and we need to see that improvement as well. Finally, just on Jamie's example, I think the best thing for us would be around local nature networks. At the moment, there's talk around local nature networks. There's a risk that they could just be seen as new maps and diagrams, and nothing actually happens. I think, to answer Jamie's question, it'd be brilliant to be able to walk along your local nature network, see that connected into a national nature network, and be able to see and experience the biodiversity improvements that we all know need to happen. So I think that's probably the key thing for us in terms of actually delivery and seeing the improvements and actually feeling them and benefiting from them.
Brilliant, thanks Dougie. We've got a few more questions coming in on the chat now, and I was going to go to one from Bruce Wilson first. Bruce, I was wondering, we've got a few MSPs and we've got some researchers on the call today, which is great. And I'll just paraphrase it quickly because we're running short of time, I think. But it is difficult to engage policymakers, MSPs, and ministers on the sort of environmental, economic issues. And I think the kind of heartfelt question there is why is that sometimes so hard? Brian, if you want to come in, that'd be great.
Thank you. First of all, Chris, thank you for organising this, and thank you for all the presenters. I think it's been really fascinating. I would push back a little bit. I don't think it necessarily is difficult to interact with us. I would interact. I'll take meetings from anybody. I will. This is my portfolio: environment, biodiversity, land reform. I am on a very sharp learning curve as well. I mean, I think I came from a position where I was reasonably knowledgeable about this stuff. I think from a very early age, I was into nature in a very big way, and recognised the issue we have. We've had this discussion many times with many people around. It's not just a climate crisis. There's a nature emergency sitting alongside that, and both go hand in hand. So I think I would be interested to know how you've tried to engage with politicians, because in my experience, I certainly can speak for myself. I am more than happy to speak with the industry and with experts to continue to grow my knowledge base and to take to the chamber the issues that you raise, because they are probably the greatest thing that and this is a big thing to say just now. It's one of the greatest things, the biggest thing we have to deal with right now, and the more info that we have as politicians, the more that we can take good data and good knowledge into the chamber, the more chance we have of affecting policy and changing policy. So it's almost I'm flinging it back at you. We're here. I'm definitely here to hear your views and to hear your points of view that I can take to the chamber. I hope that answers your question.
It's very helpful. Bruce, you want to come in on that?
I mean, just very briefly, because I know we've got no time, definitely not directed towards you, Brian, but just kind of policymakers in general. I think we're talking here. We have an unbelievable body of proof saying that we need to move so much more quickly than we are at the moment. We've just seen draft national planning framework that has an aspiration of halting biodiversity decline and doing the best for nature and climate. Drill into policy there, and it's really not delivering. And we're seeing the NSET that James mentioned there. It's not delivering the transformational change that we need. So something is, I think we're engaging as much as we can at the moment. We can always do more as NGOs and others, but we're just not seeing the policy transformation. I think there's something that comes out in the wash there that just means we're always losing out in that debate to other interests, and it's hard to know, because as James has outlined, the huge return on investment from this way of environmental putting this environmental economics into practice, and we obviously aren't making the points strongly enough, and we can always do more, but yeah.
Well, I think, as Brian has said, the MSPs who've taken the time to join us today are not the people who are proving difficult to reach.
Absolutely, no,
just very, very quickly, if you've got questions you need asked, if you've things that you need to be brought to the chamber, things you need to be brought to ministers, just email me, ask me the questions, and we'll quite happily take those questions to the ministers. I'm trying really, really hard to catch you up, expert. An awful lot more than I do with this, even though I have a huge interest in it. And with the pertinent right questions that you're alluding to today, give me them, and I'll take them to the chamber.
Well, we will bank that very kind offer. Thanks, Brian. James, you've been keen to come in.
Yeah, if I can just make a short contribution to that really interesting debate there. Yeah, I mean, yes, it's great having MSPs here and their researchers and so on. That's fantastic. I think the problem, as I see it, is that the environment gets put in a box, and it's often, you know, relatively easy to get the environmental point of view put across. But there's a massive gap in seeing it connected in so many different ways to every other part of civic society. You know, the model of sustainability I like is that environment underpins society, and society underpins the economy. You can't have a healthy economy without a healthy society, can't have a healthy society without a healthy environment. So the environment should permeate everything. It should be permeating the investment sector, the agricultural sector, construction sector, land management sector, planning sector, the enterprise agencies. It should be everywhere. And, you know, there was an interesting article by the Ferret recently showing that business interests are always very strongly represented on, say, the boards of our environmental agencies, but the reverse never happens. Environmentalists are never invited into the kind of boardrooms of business, and they're never invited, well, certainly not easily or often into discussions around these much wider, much broader policy issues.
Thanks, James. Well, as Bruce alluded to, we are running terribly short of time. We've just got a couple of minutes to go, so I don't think I'm going to be able to get to you for your question. Phoebe, apologies for that. What I was going to finish on was really just to say a huge thank you to everybody for coming along. It's an important discussion. I think there's a few things that have you know, really come across for me over the last hour, and James was really heading there, which is the absolute critical connection between our own future and that of nature, and the scale and the urgency and the threat, which I hope we've communicated reasonably well today, but we clearly have more to do. And I think that element that nature is the context in which everything we are doing has to happen. It's not sitting in a separate silo off to the side. I think the sort of second main thing coming out of the presentations and the discussions for me has really been that the absolute criticality of setting statutory environmental targets. It has driven the work we've done on climate. It will drive the work we need to do on nature, and it will drive the systemic change we need to see. But without those targets, without robust targets, we won't see any of, I think we're far less likely to see that shift. And I think the other sort of latter point where we were going with sort of concrete examples, and concrete is poor choice of words, but it's the need to transform our economy and open up the really huge opportunities that investing in nature creates, not just to make the future better, but to make our lives better. And with that, and bang on 2 o'clock, I would say that we're working on developing some more proposals for what we think a nature positive economy could look like in Scotland, and we hope to produce that over the summer. And the next event in this COP15 series will take place in June, and it will be about how we can effectively protect 30% of Scotland's land and sea for nature by 2030. So please do look out for the invitation to that event. And a final huge thank you to our speakers today, and for all of you for participating. It's been really interesting.